Perfect. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for today's short discussion presentation on some of the changes that were made to the CECLSolver tool a couple of weekends ago. So first off, let me just say, it's my responsibility to communicate these types of changes better. So I apologize to you, our users, for not more effectively doing that. Our desire, and as we explained in the email and in the videos that Steve sent out, was prior to January of this year, our focus was on presenting the cumulative impact of the changes that the ACL or CECL would bring to the reserve process, different from the ALLL. And that's why we captured those on the summary page as we did. However, moving forward, now that the ACL is the methodology necessary for calculating a reserve, it's important to note that there is a need to establish individual reserves for not only the loan portfolio, for the held to maturity securities and the unfunded commitments. We didn't feel like the way we had presented that in leading up to this year really presented it or suggested that that was the way it should be done. And we felt like we were going to be doing you a disservice if you ended up, capturing all that in one reserve account. As a result, we made the changes that we did. But again, based on, it's clear to us, and again, it's my responsibility that we did not communicate that effectively enough. So again, our apologies. So what we want to do today, and have been trying to do leading up to today, is not only, again, acknowledge our mistake, apologize for it, make the corrections, and provide some updates on the information, which Steve has done, and we've done not only through the email, but Steve's video, and then now today, and then we'll continue to address it next week in the coffee talk, and then certainly for any of you individually if you need further assistance. So that's why we're here today. Again, our apologies. I will make sure we do a better job in the future, because we are going to continue to try to improve the product. I don't want to ignore the fact that this was done in the pursuit of trying to consistently and continually improve our product based on not only what we believe will make improvements, but also what we're hearing from the industry. So that's a very long-winded way of saying we made a change. We're sorry we didn't communicate it effectively, but here's why, and here's the fix. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve. He's going to kind of talk you through again why we did it, what it looks like, and then we'll certainly open it up for questions. And just so you know, we will make a copy of today's presentation along with a link to the recording and the slides available as always. So Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Again, everyone, we're going to be saying some of the same kind of things in a couple different ways as we go through this today. So if you have questions, just shoot in the chat or the Q&A. You don't have to wait till the end. We can take a look at that, and because we're here to try to allay those concerns and answer those questions if there's any confusion as a result of us kind of slightly shifting the way we present some of the values on the summary tab and a couple of the other tabs in the tool. But as Sean was mentioning, prior to adoption of CECL, prior to this year, the primary goal of the tool was to give you an overall comparison of CECL versus the old ALLL or incurred loss model. And so we provided what we call sort of a total CECL impact calculation, where we were adding in, the adjustment to the reserve that was going to be necessary, or a change in the reserve as a result of a change in methodology, in addition to the creation of a new allowance for unfunded commitments if necessary, and a new allowance for the securities portfolio, which doesn't pertain to very many of you, but was still a potential change as well. But now that CECL, we're kind of all neck deep in these specific accounting adjustments. Now that we've all officially, or almost all of us have officially adopted CECL, that value, that kind of total CECL impact calculation doesn't show up in the call reports or on your financials as one specific line item, right? There are 3 separate line items for that. And so the reason for this change was to avoid confusion and try to be more clear about what the specific adjustments you'd be making on the call reports, on the financial statements as a result of the ALLL changing to an ACL on the loan portfolio, right? That contra asset account that's below gross loans on our balance sheet. And then in a separate part of the balance sheet, this new reserve for unfunded commitments. And then also in a separate part of the balance sheet, the adjustment to the securities portfolio if necessary. So again, what has changed, 3 separate line items that we have to deal with. And just to give you an idea, this is what the tool looked like prior to a couple weeks ago, where we showed the calculation of the ACL for the loan portfolio. We then showed the we added the reserve for the securities, and we added any surplus or shortfall for the unfunded commitments to come up with that total CECL requirement. But now we want to make sure that you're getting the right line items on the call reports. So this is what the call reports are going to look like as of March 31st. So the first time you fill out a call report under CECL is going to be almost exactly a month from now, sometime mid-April. And the first one you'll see on the call report is under investment securities in the statement of financial condition, the balance sheet. Item 10 is the allowance for credit losses on investment securities. So think of it as just like with the loan portfolio, we now have this sort of contra asset account for the securities portfolio. Second is there's our allowance for credit losses for loans and leases. You can see item 16 is what you've always been filling out, right? For the old school ALLL, the net to your gross loans. Now we have item 17, which you'll start filling out in March. Only to be done once you have adopted ASC 326 with anyone who has a 12/31 end of fiscal year has now adopted it. And so this will be the first time you're filling it out right there. And then last, but sort of least, I guess, kind of least, is on the liability side, the other side of the balance sheet. This is where we have the allowance established for credit losses on the off-balance sheet credit exposures. That is a completely new line item on your call report. This is not something that has been asked of you, at least on the call reports in the past. So that's why we created the unfunded commitments tab, and the methodology, sort of the module that we have in the tool for you, was in advance and in expectation of this new line item. So now that we have it, we know exactly where to put it separately and independently of the reserve or the ACL for the existing loan portfolio. And so finally, this is the updated summary page. The summary page now just focuses on the loan portfolio. Instead of mixing sort of apples and somewhat oranges to get an overall impact calculation, we want to know the specific components. So first component, the most important one, obviously, by a wide margin, is the ACL for the loan portfolio. So it's calculated. It's clear here that the loan portfolio summary is focused on that line item for the call report. And then separately on the HTM Securities tab, this is presented as it has been. There always has been the ACL required for the HTM Securities was on this tab. It still is on this tab. There's no big change to this tab. Same with the unfunded commitments. The presentation on this tab is identical to how it's always been, where we show what the required amount is. If you currently had an amount already on the books, which very few of you did because it was not asked of you on the call reports in the past, and then if you're what your surplus or shortfall would be. So in the past, last year, this probably would have been all shortfall, right? If you hadn't established a reserve for the unfunded commitments, the entire amount that you needed in the reserve would be shortfall, right? You'd have to create that new allowance. Now, moving forward, after March 31st, we're going to have a line item on the call report. And so we'll be able to say, all right, as of March 31st, our amount that we had established was, let's say, $10,000. And now let's say it's June 30th, it's next quarter. We're doing the calculation over, and now it says we need 12,000. So we are short 2,000, right? So now we'll know what that new reserve needs to be, and any shortfall here will be added to your loan loss provision on the income statement. And so those are the three pages, again, most of the tabs look as they have. The one tab that's different is the summary, because we're not adding those other two reserves to the loan loss reserve. We're keeping them separate so that you keep them separate in your mind conceptually. Sean?
Yeah, thank you. We had a question come in around the HTM securities. If your investment portfolio is just CDs or something that's guaranteed, the question was, do I have to reserve for it? And the answer is no. Again, these are focused on securities that a credit union might have that are atypical, right? Something that even if you held it to maturity, there potentially there poses the risk of credit risk, right? Which would be something atypical for a credit union to hold. If your portfolio consists of agencies, treasuries, CDs, things that have a principal guarantee, then the reserve is not necessary.
Let's not confuse true credit risk with something like interest rate risk, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very different animal. This is a risk of loss of principal. And just so everyone knows, on our last coffee talk, we did some polling questions, and one of our polling questions was, are you expecting to make any adjustment to the securities portfolio from a CECL standpoint? I think we had over 200 credit unions on that call, and 95% of them said no. So this is very atypical for a regular credit union to have to worry about that at all.
Yeah. The next question is, for the unfunded commitments, do we create a quote unquote contra liability account? How does this work?
Well, no, it's a good question. It's a contra asset account, so it's just a regular liability account. That's a question more for the accounting question. But my understanding is simply you're not netting it against anything else. It's just simply its own liability. It's a potential liability that you have, so it's a positive liability value.
Yeah, Steve, let's just go back to the call report, because that probably shows it better, right? So the reserve, our traditional ALLL reserve, was a contra account, but this new unfunded commitments, which again, in the ALLL, this was an optional analysis that most credit unions, virtually all credit unions, except the largest ones, did not really account for. So CECL is making that, or the ACL is making that now a requirement that you at least evaluate whether there's a reserve necessary. But if there is in fact a reserve necessary, as you can see from the call report, it's simply going to be a new liability account because again, prior to this, and these loans yet do not exist, right? So this is just an additional potential, as Steve said, liability that we're doing. Yeah,
and it's not going to work the same way as your typical loan loss reserve, because you're never going to have a loss on this allowance, right? Because an unfunded commitment would have to become funded. It would have to turn into a loan. It would then be on your balance sheet as a loan. And then if there was a charge off, that would go against that reserve. So you're not having charge offs going against this reserve. It's just they had FASB, the account, they had to find some way, or felt the need to find some way to quantify any type of risk, that additional types of risk, right? In addition to our regular risk on our existing loans. And if you have, a commitment to extend credit in the future that could see losses, there is a small amount of additional risk there, and it's quantified through this additional liability.
Thank you, Steve. So the next question, oops. I just scrolled away from you. Hold on one second. Given the Fed's recent comments and the Silicon Valley Bank failure, are they going to force us to look at market value on the treasuries and reserve that interest rate risk potential? So that's separate from CECL, right? So let's just get that out of the way. But we already kind of do that in the AOCI, right? I mean, for the unrealized value, if you go down even on this screen that Steve has up, there's an accumulated unrealized gain or loss on available for sale debt securities. That's actually where, you account for that today. I think given the recent events, I think there'll be clearly more focus on that than there has been, up until now. But that's, again, a separate analysis from what we're talking about here in CECL. But at the end of the day, I think if you have a large unrealized loss in your available for sale debt securities, I think it potentially could garner more interest into your credit side now, because you don't want to, those coming together could be, you know, a less than ideal situation. So I think if you have a large unrealized loss, I think you could probably anticipate potentially more focus on the credit side moving forward. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Nope.
Okay. All right, a couple more coming in. Are we required to create the separate GL for securities on our balance sheet, even if we do not have or did not plan to have these? It's a really good question. I would probably say, again, the safest thing to do is yes, create them. Could you get away with it? Absolutely. But that's going to be an individual situation with your regulator and your auditor. Clearly, the best practice is since they are asking you to evaluate these, is to have the GL account. But
Yeah.
you know, again, I can't speak to what every regulator or auditor is going to say to you when they come in. But I would tell you, since it's part of the methodology, I would have the reserve account established. Steve, anything you want to add there?
No, I would, since it's part of the methodology and it's an explicit line item that's been added to the call report.
Yeah.
Right, putting a zero for that when you don't have a GL for it, you know, opens up other issues. So I would say to be safe, probably, even if it's something that, you know, you create the bucket and you're never putting anything into it.
Okay, so Barbara had the follow-up question. What if those are not available for sale, but HTM classified? So again, that's an interest rate risk question. I think it's probably worthwhile to think about what that potential unrealized loss is. But again, that won't impact you for the ACL, but it is certainly something, regardless, I would probably want to know, because again, it's a little bit of conflating things, right? There's exposure, but there are different types of exposure. The ACL and what we're doing here in CECL is solely focused on credit risk. And so I think with the available for debt securities, even if they are in your HTM portfolio, that becomes really more kind of a stress test, right? It's almost like, okay, now that our capital might be impacted by that, do I have sufficient liquidity to not have to draw on those HTM securities? And so they're separate, but they're certainly important, you know, to the solvency of any institution. But I think as it relates to CECL, they're not going to ask you about it for this. Steve, anything there you want to add?
Nope. That's how I would classify it.
All right. So next up, and I apologize, this came through the Q&A, so we're just getting to it now. I should have jumped over there when it came in. But should I use last quarter's ACL figure for 12/31/22 for next call report, since we run the WARMs quarterly? So again, I think it depends on when you do your analysis. I mean, I would tell you for your 3/31 call report data, you should certainly use your 3/31 balances. You might, obviously still have to use the loss runs from 12/31, but I would update your WARMs and update your 3/31 balances for your 4/30 call report, if that's the question, Steve.
Yeah, so I mean, there's always this trickiness of lag, right? And that's not new with CECL. It's some people feel like it's exacerbated under CECL, but in my opinion, the effect is even less. And what I mean by that is, whenever we're doing an analysis as of a specific date, we never have perfect data leading directly up to that date, right? If we're relying on environmental data, whether it's economic data that we have up to a certain point in the past, whether it's our own call report data, whether it's peer data, there's going to be some amount of lag, which is reasonable and acceptable in the industry already. Under CECL, there's still going to be that lag of some sort. But since we're looking further back into history with CECL, right, we're looking at historical loss rates, and we're actually going back, depending on the length of your WARM, multiple years to aggregate that data. Anything that's happened since we have the last piece of data in the last month or two, let's say, is more of a current condition than a long-term historical trend. And so you could capture that. So I think it's a little bit less important under CECL. But if you're doing an ACL calculation as of a specific date, it has to be as of that date. So we want to make sure we at least have your balances be, You know, you don't want to say, well, my ACL from my March 31st call report is going to be as of December 31st. It can't be. It has to be as of March 31st. But what that might mean, the only thing that might actually mean is that you make sure the balances are typed in or overridden as March 31st. And you've gone through and said, look, I have a historical analysis that's as of 12/31. I'm going to look to see, has anything significantly changed over the last 3 months internally, right? Have I had any big losses, any big environmental changes since the historical analysis, which is a little bit older? If there is, you make a Q factor adjustment to account for a change in current conditions. If not, you say, listen, you know, our current, where we are right now as of March 31st, pretty much the same as it's been up to December 31st. So the only effectual change you'd be making to make the reserve as of, or the ACL as of 3/31, is to update your balances. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right. So the next, and again, I thank you for all the questions. We're going to get to all of them. I just cruising along here. So next up was, as far as I know, that as long as in our disclosure on the line of credit, we don't need to reserve for the unfunded commitment, correct? I think what isn't said there, but what you're saying is if you have the ability to cancel that line of credit, then you don't need to reserve for it. If that's what you're asking, then yes, but again, unfunded commitments need to be evaluated for reserve. You may determine no reserve is necessary, but you do need to reserve for them. Steve, anything?
The only way you can get around having to deal with some sort of analysis to see whether you have credit risk in your unfunded commitments is if they meet the definition of unconditionally cancelable. Unconditionally cancelable means, so if you have in your contract for these unfunded commitments that at any given point in time, you could revoke that additional, that unused line. You could freeze it, cancel it, whatever, and you don't have to jump through a bunch of legal or regulatory hoops to do so, then it meets the definition of unconditionally cancelable. Things like unused credit card lines are always they're kind of a definition of unconditionally cancelable because those contracts are always written in such a way that you can freeze that additional unused line of credit at your will. So I think I'm just reiterating what Sean said. If your disclosure said for those contracts are written that way, then yes, it would all be unconditionally cancelable. And then you wouldn't have to establish any reserve for it. But if at any point in time you have no way of getting out of potentially extending that credit, then you have to estimate if there's what, if any, potential loss there could be.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Next up, and Joey, thank you for posting this. So if everybody looks in the chat, this is kind of a follow-up to the question, but Joey posted a page from a CU Insight article talking about credit unions that have a large amount of treasury securities or other government-backed securities. And again, kind of cites the guidance for that because of the explicit guarantee of the government, that's enough to conclude that a credit loss reserve is not required. And again, that's why we've said interest rate risk that we're talking about with Silicon Valley Bank and available for sale securities, that's like one side of it, right? We're focused just on credit risk here with CECL, and this again gives an example of why those types of securities, agency treasuries, government-sponsored mortgage-backed bank CDs, are not necessary to be evaluated for reserve because the credit risk is kind of mitigated with the government guarantee. Next up,
thanks for that, Joe. We appreciate you posting that on there.
Thank you very much. So everybody
helpful.
Can check the chat for that as well.
Yeah.
What if the AALL GL is 719,000? What would be the range of GL for the unfunded commitments? So again, let's go back, Steve, to your unfunded commitments. So this is actually going to be on the liability side for unfunded commitments. Go to the call report presentation.
Oh, sorry.
So it will actually just be a new line item on your liability side. So I wouldn't necessarily show it where your reserve for the loan portfolio is today in the ALLL. I would establish a new liability account, as you can see, as the call report's doing, just for credit losses on off-balance sheet credit exposures. Steve, anything to add there?
Nope.
Okay, let's see a couple more questions that I haven't gotten to.
Yeah, there's a Q&A there, David.
Yeah. So we have a $218 unfunded commitment amount. Then the offset to set it up as an expense account that would show the initial 218 expense, correct?
Yes, and if yeah, give me a second. What I want to see if I can do is we showed the balance sheet stuff here, but I'd like to see if I can show you guys the statement, the income statement real quick with that to see, because that anything that happens, any adjustments you need to make to these reserves, that's what is on the income statement, right? If it's an adjustment to if you recalculated your ACL for the loan portfolio and it's higher after taking into account charge-offs, recoveries, and any other adjustments, the provision for loan losses is where you make that adjustment. Same thing for the securities and same thing for the unfunded commitment. So to establish the initial reserve for unfunded commitments, the entire amount is an expense in the first period, right? Because you have to establish that you're going from 0 to that number. So the entire amount has to come from somewhere. It would be an expense, and it's usually not. I don't believe it's in the other expenses. I think it's right there inside the provision for loan losses on the summary income statement. But I can verify that again so that we can see it in black and white.
Yeah, Steve,
ahead.
while you're looking for that, and I'll just say, these are all good questions that many of them we will probably recycle onto the coffee talk next week when we have Paul Allen on from Saltmarsh. Because again, I think, Steve, this initially though could be a day one. If you're establishing it as of 12/31, then it wouldn't have to have run through the income statement. Going forward, just like we always have with our provision, we would run it through the income statement. But again, I think they can establish it initially just through the capital account for day one.
Oh, you know what? You're right.
So
that
really,
should work. That should work the same way. Sorry, I did misspeak. It should work the same way as the establishment of the reserve, because the day one adjustment for your loan portfolio is really establishing a new reserve for your loan portfolio, and that initial time on day one doesn't go through the income statement. It just comes directly out of undivided profits or retained earnings, and it would work the same way. That's the trick is that it's not it's a little different than how it works for commercial banks, because commercial banks to some extent had already established this. It was already on their call reports. So it's a little different, slightly different presentation for credit unions.
And that was, I mean, if you want to call it quote unquote, the benefit of the day one analysis, right? Is that if you were establishing this new, and so David, that's, I'm assuming that's the new amount that you're talking about. So if you do that as your day one, then it doesn't have to run through the income statement. Any adjustment increasing that in the future, starting here in the first quarter, then that would, then run through the expense.
This is why I have Sean on here with me.
That's
get me back in line.
We're always tag teaming this, but again, we'll have this question Paul address specifically, on the coffee talk.
Here we go. Here we go. This is the new stuff on the income statement. You have your, so in the past, we had a single line item, provision for loan and lease losses. It was line 11 on, was that page 4 of the call report? And now it says skip to item 12 if you have adopted CECL, which means that starting March 31st, you're no longer you're gonna have multiple expense items in here, right? For the securities, for the loan portfolio, and for the off-balance sheet credit exposure to the unfunded commitment. Interesting. This is a different presentation than the FDIC does for commercial banks as well. But you're no longer putting in one bucket. You now have 4 separate buckets right on the summary income statement for those 4 items. So day 2 and beyond, this is how we manage our adjustments to the reserve, the established reserve accounts.
Yeah. So hopefully that helped, but if not, certainly follow up with us. But I think, again, that was the quote unquote benefit of day one.
There we go.
All right. So let's see. I think I'm not sure if there's any additional questions. So again, we will, like I said, and I would certainly encourage you, if you have anything specifically you want us to ask of Paul, email those into us, and we'll make sure we address them. But like I said, a lot of these, which are great questions, we will, ask a second time, because while Steve and I did stay at a Holiday Inn last night, we are not, we're not CPA. So I'd rather, again, we certainly can offer our understanding, but I would, welcome the ability to bounce these off Paul next week, who we have used repeatedly with questions like this in advance to confirm our understanding. But sometimes it comes best from an auditor's mouth rather than ours. Okay, we had another question come through in the chat. In the past, we've included a reserve for unfunded commitments in our ALLL. Would we therefore do a reclass to set up the liability? I would say yes. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And that's a good question for Paul as well, too, because other of you might have that, because since there wasn't a spot for it on the call report in the past, if you were someone who did that, then you'd have to have done it like you did, but probably won't be.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if there's any additional questions. If not, thank you all for taking the time today to join us. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you better understand why we did make the change. Again, we'll look forward to having you on the Coffee Talk next week, where again we'll have Paul Allen on from Saltmarsh to give his viewpoint on a lot of these same questions. Anything else, if you need additional attention, just reach out to David or Jason. Thank you, Amy, for the kind words about the CECLSolver. And we will look forward to speaking to you. But if you do need more consultation, reach out to David and Jason. We can get something set up to assist you. So, Steve, any final words before we let everybody to their day?
Nope. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today. And again, next Friday, that Coffee Talk is going to be great. So if you can join us, if you can't make it to the Coffee Talk, you can always just register for it anyway, and then we'll have your email so that we can send you a link to the copy of the recording. And if you can't make it, but you have a question, call the sales team, or if we can certainly ask a question on your behalf to Paul next Friday. So any way that you would like to get it, we can help you get it.
Great. Agreed. And today's presentation, we will send a link to the recording and to the slides as well. And enjoy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Friday. Thanks again so much.
Thanks, everybody.